Big Shaq froze in shock as he spotted an elderly woman huddled on the sidewalk of Los Angeles. It was none other than his former teacher, the very person who had once changed his life. But now, she had been abandoned by her family, forgotten by society, and reduced to a life of heartbreak and homelessness. What will Shaq do to help her and confront this injustice? Share where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to spread this inspiring story. Los Angeles was cloaked in the chill of a winter evening as the sun dipped behind towering skyscrapers, casting a pale glow across the streets. Skid Row, often called the end of the American dream, lay shrouded in the shadows of despair and hardship. Makeshift shelters of tarps and tattered fabric crowded the streets, where the forgotten struggled to survive amid the stench, arguments, and bone-chilling cold. Shaquille O'Neal, the retired basketball icon, sat in his luxurious SUV. The warm interior lighting and the soft jazz playing through the speakers couldn't dispel the emptiness weighing on his heart. A long, exhausting day had finally ended, but his mind wandered, lost in a fog of scattered thoughts, until his attention was drawn to the scene outside his window. On the sidewalk, amidst the wavering figures under dim streetlights, an elderly woman caught his eye. She sat hunched on the cold ground, a thin, tattered blanket barely covering her frail frame. The biting wind whipped through, tossing her snow-white hair into disarray. Her posture, head bowed and body curled as if trying to disappear from the world, stirred something deep within him. A mix of sadness and an inexplicable sense of familiarity washed over him. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening. There was something about this woman that made it impossible to look away. The trembling of her thin shoulders, the weathered hands darkened by years of struggle, and, most of all, her face. Though lined with wrinkles and exhaustion, it held a faint trace of a memory he couldn't quite grasp. A flicker from the past flitted through his mind, blurred and distant. He frowned, straining to piece it together. His heart ached unexpectedly. It was as if the cold out there didn't just seep into her skin, but also pierced straight into his own. That feeling, both familiar and heart-wrenching, was like a whisper urging him to act. But why? Why did this woman unsettle him so deeply? Questions without answers swirled in his mind, but one thing he knew for sure: she didn't belong here. The car came to a stop at a red light. The silence inside grew deafening, yet Shaq's thoughts roared with conflicting emotions. He could have simply looked away, driven on, and left the heartbreaking scene behind, as he had countless times before. But her gaze, even as she looked down, seemed to hold him in place. In that fleeting moment, he realized he couldn't just drive away. He had to do something, even though he didn't yet know what that would be. Shaq couldn't take his eyes off the woman's face. For a moment, it was as if the entire world blurred away, leaving only her, a frail figure with sunken eyes and an aged face deeply etched with lines of time and suffering. And then, suddenly, the memories came flooding. Back, overwhelming and unexpected, like a torrent sweeping away all other thoughts in his mind. Mrs. Henderson. Mrs. Henderson. That name rang like a bell from the past, pulling him back to his childhood years. She had been his elementary school teacher, the one he respected the most. A dedicated woman who believed in the potential of her students, even when they doubted themselves. To Shaq, she wasn't just a teacher. She was the one who had planted the seeds of confidence and resilience in him. A shy boy, self-conscious about his towering, clumsy frame, and often the target of ridicule. He remembered those days sitting in the small classroom where Mrs. Henderson patiently guided him through every word and sentence. She didn't just teach him how to read and write. She taught him how to stand tall, hold his head high, and believe in his own worth. "Shaquille," she had once said, "your height isn't a burden. It's a gift. One day, you'll see that." At the time, her words were like a small flame, igniting hope within the boy who had felt consumed by self-doubt and fear. But now, the fire that once burned brightly in her eyes seemed extinguished. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had once stood confidently before the blackboard with a gaze full of hope, now sat huddled on a cold sidewalk, forgotten amidst a glittering yet ruthless city. The thin blanket draped over her fragile frame did little to shield her from the biting cold, and the hands that once held chalk now trembled, weathered by hardship. A wave of pain and helplessness washed over Shaq. He didn't just see Mrs. Henderson. He saw the injustice, the cruelty of life, and the relentless passage of time. Shaq took a deep breath, trying to suppress the emotions rising within him. He knew Mrs. Henderson hadn't ended up here solely because of fate. Life could be harsh, but people like her, those who dedicated their lives to educating and shaping future generations, didn't deserve to be discarded like this. How did it come to this? The question echoed in his mind, unanswered. A quiet anger stirred within him, directed not just at society but also at the people around her, her sons. Memories of them flickered in his mind. He remembered hearing her talk about them during lessons, her eyes lighting up whenever she spoke of her small family, 2 sons in whom she placed all her hopes. But where were they now? How could they let Mrs. Henderson fall into such dire circumstances? Shaq couldn't help but feel a simmering anger toward the sons who had failed in their duty, the very people who should have been her support in her time of need. His thoughts delved deeper into fragmented images of her life. Perhaps it wasn't just her sons who had abandoned her. Perhaps society itself had turned its back on someone who had devoted her entire life to others. He couldn't fathom what could have led to a woman like Mrs. Henderson, once a symbol of knowledge and integrity, being reduced to such a state. The traffic light turned green, but Shaq didn't notice. He remained rooted in place, staring at Mrs. Henderson, a storm of emotions churning inside him. Memories interwove with the present, forming an incomplete but profoundly sorrowful picture. The woman who had once believed in and uplifted him now needed him to save her. But what could he do? He didn't know the answer, but he knew one thing. He couldn't walk away. Not from her. Outside, Mrs. Henderson huddled tighter as a cold gust of wind swept past, clutching the thin blanket as if it were the only thing she had left in the world. Something inside Shaq ignited. There was no room for hesitation anymore. She needed him, and he wasn't going to let history repeat itself, where those who once loved her had abandoned her to loneliness and despair. The car remained stationary at the intersection, the red light reflecting off the windshield, but Shaquille O'Neal was oblivious to the world around him. The image of Mrs. Henderson, his former teacher who once uplifted him, now huddled on the freezing sidewalk, haunted him like an inescapable pain. Her frail shoulders trembled in the biting wind, and her eyes, once filled with kindness and hope, now bore only exhaustion, as if she had surrendered everything. Shaq tried to piece together her story in his mind, but the fragments were too vague. How could someone like her have fallen to such depths? She had once been a symbol of resilience and dedication, a woman who devoted her life to imparting knowledge, faith, and love to her students. Yet now, there she sat, forgotten, abandoned, as if she had never existed. Shaq couldn't stop questioning the people who should have been there for her. Her two sons, the ones she had spoken of so proudly while standing at the front of the classroom, where were they now? He recalled the stories she used to share during lessons, how she sacrificed everything to raise them right. She had spent her meager salary on tuition, books, and ensuring their futures. But now, when she needed them the most, where were they? A surge of anger welled up within Shaq. Those sons hadn't just abandoned her, they had betrayed her. They hadn't merely shirked their responsibilities, they had erased the memory of the mother who had given them everything. He could imagine her calling them, hoping for a sliver of support or comfort, only to be met with excuses, empty promises, and, eventually, deafening silence. But her pain didn't stem solely from her family. Shaq knew this society had no place for the vulnerable, especially the elderly like Mrs. Henderson. The support systems, if they existed at all, were nothing more than empty assurances. A woman who had spent her life contributing to her community, who had been a guiding light for countless students, was now seen as a burden, forgotten amidst the ruins of Skid Row. A stronger gust of wind blew through, carrying the stench of nearby alleys. Shaq watched as Mrs. Henderson pulled a tattered blanket tighter around herself, as if it were her last shield against the cold and the harshness of life. His chest ached, not just for her, but for the blatant injustice before him. How could someone like her be pushed to such a breaking point? How could the world be so cruel? The traffic light turned green, and the driver glanced back at him. "Mr. Shaq, shall we go?" The words jolted him back to reality, but they weren't enough to dispel the turmoil in his mind. For a moment, Shaq looked through the car window again, seeing Mrs. Henderson still sitting there, small, alone, and utterly powerless. He knew he could turn away. The car could move forward down the street like any other passerby. She likely wouldn't even notice his presence, and the world would continue spinning as if nothing had happened. But deep down, he understood that he couldn't do that. Not to Mrs. Henderson, not to the woman who had taught him about kindness, patience, and the value of never abandoning anyone. Shaq turned to the driver, his voice low but resolute. "Pull over." The driver looked surprised but quickly complied. The large SUV slowly came to a stop at the curb. Shaq took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what was to come. As he opened the car door and stepped out, a blast of icy air hit him square in the face, but he didn't care. He looked toward Mrs. Henderson, his eyes filled with emotions, helplessness, sorrow, and determination. Each step he took felt heavy as he approached her, but it wasn't hesitation weighing him down. It was the weight of confronting a painful truth, a truth he could no longer ignore. Mrs. Henderson had once saved the soul of a lost child. Now it was his turn to save her. Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of the SUV, unfazed by the curious gazes and murmurs of passers-by. With his towering frame and purposeful stride, he seemed to silence the world around him, if only for a moment. He walked slowly toward Mrs. Henderson, each step feeling heavy with the pain and confusion warring within him. Ahead, Mrs. Henderson sat hunched on the sidewalk, oblivious to his presence. The cold wind tousled her silver hair, revealing a gaunt face and weathered skin. She kept her head bowed low, as if trying to shrink away, to disappear from the cruelty of the world. Shaq paused in front of her, his gaze fixed on a face that had once been a symbol of kindness and wisdom. His voice, thick with emotion, broke the silence. "Mrs. Henderson." The sound of his voice startled her, and she looked up abruptly. For a fleeting moment, her tired eyes lit up with surprise, perhaps even a flicker of joy, but it was quickly replaced by shame. Embarrassment spread across her face as she realized the state she was in, her most vulnerable self, facing a former student she had once cherished. "Shaquille, is that you?" she asked, her voice trembling with doubt and disbelief. Her eyes scanned his face, searching for confirmation that this was indeed the tall, bright-eyed boy she once believed would achieve greatness. But, almost immediately, she looked away, her hands trembling as she pulled a tattered blanket over her frail fingers and shabby clothing. She fussed with her disheveled silver hair, as though trying to hide the stark contrast between her current state and the proud, strong woman she had once been. Shaq knelt in front of her, his eyes welling up as he looked deeply into the weary eyes of his former teacher. "It's me, Mrs. Henderson. It's Shaq," he said, his deep voice warm but brimming with emotion. He wanted her to know that no matter what her circumstances were, in his eyes she was still the revered teacher who had changed his life. But Mrs. Henderson shook her head, her tear-filled eyes filled with humiliation. "I don't want you to see me like this," she murmured weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't need to worry about me, Shaquille. I'm fine." Her words sounded more like an attempt to comfort herself than him, and even she didn't seem to believe them. Shaq felt his heart shatter. He didn't just see the hardship etched into her face, he felt the deeper pain, the anguish of someone who had dedicated her life to her students only to be forgotten by society. She didn't want him to see her this way, not because she didn't want help, but because she feared disappointment in his eyes. But there was no judgment in Shaq's gaze. To him, Mrs. Henderson was still the compassionate, wise woman who had once taught him the true value of being human. "Mrs. Henderson, you don't have to do this," Shaq said, his voice steady yet gentle. "I don't care where you are or what you look like. I just want you to know that you're not alone." He placed his large hand gently over her frail ones. It was a simple gesture, but to her it felt like a beam of light cutting through the dark void of her world. Mrs. Henderson looked up at him, and for the first time tears streamed down her cheeks. They weren't tears of despair, but of gratitude, of a faint belief that perhaps she wasn't entirely forgotten. Yet she hesitated and withdrew her hand slightly, as though trying to maintain some distance. "Shaquille, I don't want to burden you. You have your own life, your future ahead of you. I'm just someone whose time has passed." Her words cut Shaq like a knife. He couldn't accept that she saw herself as nothing more than a burden. He knew the impact she had made on his life and on the lives of countless other students. She had built the foundation for the person he had become. How could he stand by and let his beloved teacher sink into darkness? Looking directly into her tear-streaked eyes, Shaq spoke with determination, his voice firm. "Mrs. Henderson, you once helped me believe I could achieve anything. Now, it's my turn to help you. I'm not leaving you here for another second." Mrs. Henderson shuddered, not from the cold, but from the weight of his words reaching deep into her heart. Though she still seemed hesitant, she didn't refuse this time. She gave a small nod, and in her eyes, for the first time in years, a faint glimmer of hope appeared. Shaq stood up, gently helping her to her feet. His towering figure shielded her from the biting wind. As he guided her toward the car, The stares and whispers of onlookers faded into irrelevance. All that mattered to Shaq in that moment was the woman beside him, the teacher who had once illuminated his path in life. Shaq gently helped Mrs. Henderson to her feet, his hand firmly holding hers as if to silently promise she would no longer have to face the cold and loneliness on her own. At first, she tried to pull her hand away, her voice soft but tinged with hesitation. "Shaquille, I really don't want to trouble you. I've gotten used to this life." But Shaq didn't let her finish. His resolute eyes locked onto hers, delivering an unspoken assurance that could not be denied. "You've done so much for me. Now it's my turn to help you. I won't let you stay here another minute," he said, his voice warm yet unyielding. Mrs. Henderson's gaze faltered. She was used to being ignored, to feeling like a burden no one wanted to carry. But Shaq's eyes, filled with determination and gratitude, softened something inside her. Finally, she gave a slight nod as if allowing herself a fleeting moment of hope, even if just for a second. The SUV glided through the chilly streets of Los Angeles, carrying with it a heavy silence between two people, a teacher and her former student. Mrs. Henderson sat in the car, her frail hands clutching a thin blanket she carried everywhere, a fragile shield against the harshness of life. Her eyes avoided Shaq's, instead gazing out the window. But he couldn't take his eyes off her. He saw the weariness in her every movement, in every shallow breath, and it weighed heavily on him. The car pulled up to a nearby hotel, its warm lights glowing like a beacon of refuge. When Shaq opened the door and gently helped her out, curious eyes from staff and guests turned toward them. An elderly woman, draped in a tattered coat, walking slowly beside a towering, well-known man. The stark contrast was impossible to ignore. But Shaq paid no attention to the stares. The whispers or judgments didn't matter anymore. "We need a room," Shaq said to the receptionist. His steady voice prompted quick action, despite the receptionist's momentary confusion upon seeing Mrs. Henderson. Within minutes, Shaq personally escorted her to the room, a clean, warm space equipped with comforts she hadn't known in years. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Henderson experienced comfort. In the bathroom, warm water cascaded over her rough, weathered skin, washing away not just dirt and cold, but fragments of painful memories that had clung to her for years. Standing before the mirror, her trembling hands touched her face, a face she barely recognized. Wrinkles, sunken eyes, and a weathered complexion told the story of her struggles. But now, at least for a moment, she felt a glimmer of peace she thought was forever lost. When she stepped out of the bathroom, Shaq was waiting with a hot meal on the table. The simple dish, chicken soup and fresh bread, felt like a feast to her. She sat down, her hands slightly shaking as she picked up the spoon. But Shaq didn't say a word. He just smiled encouragingly. "Take your time, eat slowly," he said, his voice gentle. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears, unable to find the words to express her gratitude. Instead, she whispered a quiet, "Thank you," so faint it was barely audible. When the meal was over, Mrs. Henderson leaned back in her chair, her eyes roaming the room. The warm blanket wrapped around her, the soft glow of the bedside lamp, and the faint music playing from the radio. All of it felt unfamiliar but comforting. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to fight off the cold, hunger, or the ever-present fear that shadowed her life. "Shaquille, I don't know what to say," she began, her voice catching in her throat. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this again." Shaq smiled, his expression tender but firm with resolve. "You don't have to say anything, Mrs. Henderson. I just want you to know that you deserve this, and so much more." Yet, beneath this fragile layer of newfound peace, Shaq knew this was only the beginning. He understood the depth of her suffering, how deeply the scars ran, the abandonment by her own children, the betrayal that left her isolated, had left wounds that wouldn't heal easily. He didn't just want to free her from material hardship. He wanted to restore the self-respect, faith, and optimism she once carried. That night, Shaq sat by the window, gazing at the twinkling lights of Los Angeles. He made a silent vow that this wouldn't be the only act of kindness. Mrs. Henderson deserved a better life, and he would do everything in his power to ensure she had it. The hotel room was quiet, with only the soft hum of gentle music playing from a small radio in the corner. Mrs. Henderson sat back in her chair, her eyes distant, as if the warm walls of the hotel were slowly pulling her back into a part of her memory long past. Across from her sat Shaq, his gaze attentive and calm, ready to listen to anything she wanted to share. She began to speak, her voice slow but heavy with the weight of pain long suppressed. "I used to be a teacher," she said, a flicker of pride glinting in her eyes, though it was quickly replaced by sorrow. "For over 40 years, I taught thousands of students, children who were mischievous and stubborn, and others who were shy like you were back then." Shaq smiled faintly at her mention of him. "I remember you, Shaquille," she continued. "You were taller than the others, always bowing your head in embarrassment. But I saw something in you, a spark. I knew you could do great things." But as she spoke further, her story grew darker, as though the light of those joyful memories was being overshadowed by the darkness life had dealt her. "I love my job," she went on, her voice trembling. "Those days, standing in front of the blackboard, holding a piece of chalk, watching my students eagerly learn, those were the happiest moments of my life. But life doesn't always turn out the way we hope." She spoke of her husband, the man who had shared her struggles and joys. They weren't wealthy, but they had love and companionship. "He was my rock," she said, her voice catching. "But then he left so suddenly, a heart attack." Her eyes sank deeply, as if still able to see his silhouette lingering in her memory. After her husband's passing, she tried to keep her life together, but old age and illness crept in, bringing mounting medical bills. "The arthritis made it impossible for me to stand at the blackboard anymore," she explained. "I had to leave the classroom, leave my students, and then everything began to crumble." As her health deteriorated, she was forced to sell her small home, the home she and her husband had built so many memories in, to cover her medical expenses. "I thought, at least. I had my 2 children," she said, her voice quivering. "They promised they would never leave me alone. But those promises, they were just words." Shaq frowned, feeling the weight of her pain in every word. She described how her children initially called often, even visited to take care of her. But over time, the calls became less frequent, and the promises to help turned hollow. When she asked for financial support, they claimed they had their own families to care for and bills to pay. "One day, I called my eldest son," she recounted, her voice breaking. "I just needed a little money for medication, but he told me he couldn't help me anymore. He said I needed to take care of myself." She shuddered slightly, as if reliving that heart-wrenching moment. "I gave everything to them, but I realized that when you have nothing left to give, you lose your worth in their eyes." After selling her home, she moved into a temporary shelter, but it was far from safe or peaceful. She spoke of sleepless nights, hearing arguments, screaming, and even gunshots nearby. I was terrified, but I had nowhere else to go. The final blow came when a fire broke out at the shelter. She lost everything she had left, from her identification papers to the old photos of her husband. Everything I had left in this life was reduced to ashes, she said, her voice raspy. From then on, she lived on the streets, with nothing but a tattered blanket and a heart full of sorrowful memories. Shaq said nothing. He simply sat there, quietly listening, though inside he felt a storm of emotions. Her words cut through him like knives, and his anger toward her sons grew with every passing moment. How could they abandon her like this? He couldn't fathom such selfishness and coldness, especially toward someone who had devoted her life to loving and sacrificing for them. "I don't want to blame them," she said, as if sensing his thoughts. "I think they have their own struggles, but it hurts to realize that I'm no longer a priority to anyone." Her eyes met Shaq's, clouded but carrying a faint glimmer of hope. "I never thought I'd see you again, Shaquille, and I certainly never thought anyone would care about me like this." Shaq clenched his hands under the table, struggling to keep his emotions in check. But in his heart, a silent promise was forming. He would not let her endure another day of suffering. She had once been a guiding light in his life, and now he would do everything in his power to return that light to hers. Shaq listened in silence, each word from Mrs. Henderson like a dark fragment, coming together to form a grim picture of her life in its twilight years. The memories of those wretched days emerged through her trembling voice and tear-filled eyes, piercing Shaq's heart with an unbearable ache. Life in the shelters. She paused, as if reluctant to call it life, for it was nothing more than a battle for survival. "It's not a place for someone old like me. It's a place filled with violence, despair, and cold, indifferent stares from those around you." She recounted her first nights there when she still clung to the faint hope that she might find help. But that hope quickly faded. The shelter was overcrowded, filthy, and filled with people so broken by life that they could only fight to survive. It wasn't a safe place. Fights broke out often, with shouting and sometimes heart-wrenching cries echoing through the dark nights. A few times she witnessed acts of brutality so horrifying she dared not speak of them. "There was a night," she whispered, her voice dropping to nearly a breath. "I heard quiet footsteps in the dark coming closer to my bed. I could only lie still, hold my breath, and pray they wouldn't hurt me." Shaq clenched his fists tightly as he listened, imagining Mrs. Henderson, a frail, elderly woman, living in constant fear. Meals at the shelter were always scarce, never enough to stave off the gnawing hunger. She had to compete for basic scraps of food, like bread or watery soup, with younger and stronger individuals. "I never thought there would come a day," she said, her voice choking, "when I'd have to stand in a long line just to get a piece of stale bread. Some nights, I went to sleep with nothing in my stomach, but even that wasn't the worst of it." She spoke of the fire that broke out at the shelter. That was the night when everything left of her life, her final threads to her past, was reduced to ashes. Old photographs of my husband, my teaching certificates, the books I used to teach, everything burned in that fire. She paused, her dim eyes fixed on her frail hands, as if still feeling the weight of the loss. "I tried to save them, Shaquille. They were all I had left, but the fire spared nothing." Shaq swallowed hard, unable to find words. He understood the value of those keepsakes, not just as material things, but as the fragile threads that tied her to the life she once had. And now, even those threads had been severed. After the shelter burned down, she had nowhere else to go. Skid Row, with its stench, violence, and society's neglect, became her new home. But living on Skid Row wasn't living. It was merely surviving. She described nights spent sleeping on the cold ground with a tattered blanket as her only shield against the world's cruelty. She spoke of digging through garbage bins for food and how she wept the first time she had to do it out of sheer desperation. "I used to think I had pride," she said, her voice trembling. "But when you're hungry and freezing, pride means nothing. All you want is to make it through another day." But the worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold. The worst part was the feeling of being forgotten. She told Shaq how people would glance past her on the street as if she were a ghost, as if she didn't exist. "They avoid your eyes," she said, her voice filled with quiet pain, "as if looking at you might make them catch this misery. Sometimes I wondered, am I even human anymore, or just a walking corpse?" Shaq sat frozen, her words cutting deep. Anger welled up within him, not just at the people who ignored her, but at society as a whole, a society where someone like her could be cast aside without a second thought. How could a woman who had devoted her life to education, who had been a guiding light for so many students, end up like this? "Shaquille," Mrs. Henderson said softly, her voice fading but carrying a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I'm not telling you this for pity. I just want you to understand that life doesn't always go as we expect. But meeting you today, it makes me feel like I still have some worth, like I'm still a person." Shaq tightened his grip, his gaze locking with hers. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice low and filled with emotion, "you're not just worth something. You're a person who changed my life, and I won't let you live like this another day." In his heart, Shaq made a promise. He wouldn't just help her survive, he would do everything in his power to help her reclaim her life, her dignity, and the hope she deserved. Because Mrs. Henderson wasn't a ghost. She was the teacher who once gave him light, and now it was his turn to return that light to her. Shaq sat silently for a long time after Mrs. Henderson finished her story. Her words felt like a sharp blade, cutting deep into his heart and leaving behind an ache that wouldn't fade. He knew that simply bringing her to this hotel wasn't a solution. She needed more than just a roof over her head. She deserved a life filled with dignity and happiness, the kind of life she had spent her youth giving to others. Shaq took a deep breath, his gaze resolute. "Mrs. Henderson, I promise you this won't just be one night. I'll do everything I can to help you rebuild your life." That very night, Shaq sprang into action. He opened his contact list and began calling close friends, business partners, and even charities he had worked with in the past. His deep, determined voice carried through each call, leaving no room for refusal. "I need your help," he said. "An old teacher of mine is in trouble, and I won't let her live like this for another day." Each call was a step forward in his plan. From top doctors and reputable lawyers to charity leaders, Shaq spared no effort in using every connection he had to ensure Mrs. Henderson received comprehensive support. The next morning, Shaq arranged a full medical examination for her. He knew that years of hunger and cold had left her body with wounds that wouldn't heal easily. As she sat in the clinic, the doctors saw the frailty in her trembling hands, her tired eyes, and they understood this was no ordinary patient. With Shaq's backing, she began receiving the necessary medical care, treatments for her joints, nutritional support, and psychological therapy to help her recover both physically and emotionally. But Shaq knew it wasn't just her health that needed healing. Her self-esteem and sense of purpose had to be restored as well. In the days that followed, he hired a lawyer to help her regain her identification documents, which she had lost in a fire. The process wasn't easy since she no longer had any paperwork to prove her identity. Yet, through Shaq's determination and the help of his partners, step by step, she began reclaiming her basic rights. "You're not a ghost, Mrs. Henderson," Shaq said to her one afternoon as they sat together in the hotel. "You're an incredible woman, and I want the world to remember that." For Mrs. Henderson, the thing she had cherished most in life wasn't material possessions or fame, it was teaching. Shaq knew that truly helping her meant finding a way to reconnect her with the profession that had once given her life meaning. He reached out to a community education center in Los Angeles that specialized in supporting underprivileged children. When Shaq shared Mrs. Henderson's story, the director not only agreed to help, but expressed admiration for her. "The kids here need someone like her," the director said. "Someone who's faced hardships and still holds a passion for education. She'll be an incredible source of inspiration." As he worked to help Mrs. Henderson, Shaq couldn't ignore the anger he felt toward her two sons. He knew they were the ones who had abandoned her when she needed them most. After persistent searching, he finally got in touch with them. When they met, Shaq didn't say much, but his eyes carried an unmistakable disappointment. "I don't understand you," he said, his voice low but piercing. "How could you turn your back on the mother who sacrificed everything for you?" Her sons tried to justify themselves, claiming financial difficulties and their inability to take on the responsibility of caring for her. But Shaq didn't let them off the hook. Hardship isn't an excuse to abandon the person who carried you through life. You betrayed the very woman who gave you everything. While Shaq didn't force them, his words struck like a wake-up call, leaving them with a deep sense of shame. One of the sons broke down in tears, promising to try to make amends, but Shaq knew Mrs. Henderson's trust had been deeply wounded. As the plans began to take shape, Shaq noticed a change in Mrs. Henderson. Though still frail, her eyes started to brighten, and a faint smile began to return to her face. For the first time in years, she felt she wasn't fighting alone, and all of this was sparked by the gratitude and determination of a former student she had once believed in. Shaq knew this was only the beginning, but he vowed that no matter how long it took, he would help Mrs. Henderson regain the life she truly deserved. The first days of Mrs. Henderson's journey of renewal were a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Though Shaq cared for her with unwavering dedication, she often sat quietly for hours, as if she couldn't believe she was finally leaving behind the harsh life she had endured for so many years. But Shaq refused to let her dwell in her worries. With patience and compassion, he stayed by her side, helping her reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. With Shaq's support, doctors developed a comprehensive treatment plan for Mrs. Henderson. The joint pain that once made it difficult for her to walk gradually eased thanks to modern medical therapies. Shaq frequently took her to the hospital, sometimes spending hours in the waiting room just to ensure she received the best care possible. At the same time, the process of restoring her identification documents was completed. When she held her new ID card in her hands, her eyes welled with emotion. "It feels like I'm a person again," she whispered to Shaq, her voice trembling with tears. But Shaq didn't stop there. He rented a small yet cozy apartment for her in a quiet neighborhood, far from the noise and chaos of Skid Row. The apartment had a small living room, a bedroom, and a desk by the window where sunlight poured in every morning. When she first stepped into the apartment, she stood silently, her hand trembling as she touched the clean walls. The gentle scent of the new space gave her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. "You deserve this," Shaq said, his warm smile reassuring her. Shaq understood that beyond physical healing, the most important thing was helping her rediscover her sense of worth and confidence. It was no easy task. The years she had spent being forgotten by society had left deep emotional scars. Yet Shaq constantly reminded her of the profound impact she had once had on him and countless other students. "Mrs. Henderson, you didn't just teach me how to read or write," Shaq said one evening as they sat together in her new apartment. "You taught me how to believe in myself, how to face life head on. You weren't just a teacher, you were a life changer." Those words were more than just encouragement. Shaq wanted her to feel that she still mattered, that her life still held meaning. To reinforce her confidence, Shaq organized a small reunion with some of her former students. He reached out to his old classmates, those who had once been under her guidance. Some of them were now teachers, lawyers, or community workers, people who had drawn inspiration from her dedication to build their own lives. The reunion was held in a small room at the community center. When Mrs. Henderson walked in, her eyes widened as she saw the familiar yet grown-up faces of her former students. "Do you remember me, Mrs. Henderson?" A middle-aged man smiled as he approached her. "You taught me in 3rd grade. Because of you, I believed I could actually be good at math." A young woman sitting in the front row spoke up. "You were the first person who encouraged me to read. Because of you, I'm now a writer." Mrs. Henderson looked around the room, tears streaming down her face. She was speechless, but her eyes glowed with pride and emotion. These students were living proof of her life's work, that what she had done was never forgotten. Shaq stood quietly at the back, watching the scene unfold. He noticed a change in her, the light in her eyes, her smile, and the way she stood a little taller than she had in years. The reunion didn't just bring joy, it reignited a strong sense of self-worth in Mrs. Henderson. Bit by bit, she began to believe that she was not invisible, not a burden, nor a victim. She was someone who had lived a meaningful life and could continue to live with that pride. "Thank you, Shaquille," she said at the end of the day as they shared a simple dinner in her new apartment. "I thought I had nothing left to live for, but you reminded me that I still matter, and that is more precious than anything." Shaq looked at her, his smile gentle but steadfast. "Mrs. Henderson, you're not just living for yourself. You're living for everyone you've ever inspired, and you'll never be alone." In Shaq's heart, he knew this journey was only beginning. But for Mrs. Henderson, this was the first moment of true renewal, a moment when light once again found its way into her life. The days of healing and rebuilding faith had brought Mrs. Henderson to a new turning point in her life. Shaq, with unwavering determination, had reached out to a community education center dedicated to children from disadvantaged backgrounds. When she received an invitation to become an educational mentor at the center, she could hardly believe her ears. "Can I still teach?" she asked softly, her eyes wide with surprise and a touch of uncertainty. Shaq smiled and gently held her hand. "Not only can you, but you should. Those kids need you. just like I once did." That morning, Mrs. Henderson arrived at the education center with a mix of nervousness and emotion. In her bag was a brand new box of chalk, a gift Shaq had thoughtfully prepared for this special day. As she stepped into the small classroom, its walls decorated with drawings and motivational quotes, a group of children aged 10 to 12 turned to look at her with curious eyes. "Hello, everyone," Mrs. Henderson said softly, her voice trembling slightly at first. But as she picked up a piece of chalk and wrote the first words on the board, every trace of anxiety melted away. This was where she belonged. Memories of her very first day as a teacher years ago came rushing back, filling her with warmth and joy. As she looked at the small, inquisitive faces of the children, she realized that while time had changed many things, the power of education and her love for her students remained steadfast. The children at the center, much like how she once saw herself, were vulnerable souls carrying heavy stories. A boy with sharp eyes that concealed deep sadness, a shy girl struggling to read a passage correctly, and even the stubborn ones who tried to keep their distance, all reminded her that her mission wasn't just to teach, but to help them discover themselves. During that first lesson, while teaching a simple exercise on analyzing a short story, a timid girl raised her hand and asked, "Miss, what did you do before this?" Mrs. Henderson smiled gently, her eyes soft with kindness. "I used to be a teacher, but then I stepped away from it for some time. And today, I'm so happy to be back, doing this again." The girl nodded, a flicker of admiration lighting up in her eyes. It was in that moment that Mrs. Henderson realized she still had the power to inspire, just as she had done in the past. Although the joy of teaching filled Mrs. Henderson's heart with renewed strength, the memories of her two sons' betrayal often resurfaced like haunting shadows. One day, as she saw a boy at the center, his eyes reminded her of her eldest son, the boy who had once held her hand as a child, promising never to let her be alone. "Do you blame them?" Shaq had asked her during one of their conversations. She shook her head, her gaze somber. "No, but it hurts. I thought my love and sacrifices would be enough to keep them close. But life isn't that simple." Shaq understood that the pain of being forgotten by the people she loved most wouldn't fade easily. Yet he also saw the light gradually returning to her, through the children, through the classroom, and through the faith she had rediscovered. One afternoon, after finishing her lesson, a shy boy approached her and whispered, "Miss, I've never gotten a good grade in literature before, but because of you, I got an A today." He held up his test paper, his eyes sparkling with joy. Mrs. Henderson gently placed her hand on his shoulder, a wave of warmth filling her heart. "You did wonderfully," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." In that moment, she felt not only the happiness of a teacher, but also the sense of rebirth within herself. She wasn't just giving knowledge, she was reclaiming joy and purpose from life. From a distance, Shaq watched, his heart swelling with emotion. He saw his former teacher, the woman who had once lost everything, now standing tall before a chalkboard, her eyes alight with hope and love. This wasn't just a return, it was a new beginning. Shaq knew that Mrs. Henderson's journey was far from over, but he also knew she had found her light again. The same light she had once used to brighten his life and the lives of countless students before. And this time, she wasn't walking the path alone. Shaquille O'Neal sat quietly in a chair at the back of the classroom, silently observing Mrs. Henderson as she stood at the podium. The image of her holding a piece of chalk, her eyes lighting up as she guided the children through each word, evoked a warmth in him he had never felt before. This wasn't just about giving back, it was a profound lesson in the value of compassion. When Shaq first started helping Mrs. Henderson, he merely wanted to repay her for all she had done for him. But as the days passed, he realized the change wasn't just happening to her, it was transforming him as well. He began to see the world through a different lens, understanding that compassion isn't just a choice, it's a responsibility. Shaq reflected on his childhood. Back then, Mrs. Henderson didn't just teach him lessons from textbooks, she taught him how to face himself, how to overcome insecurities about his appearance and find strength within. She never knew that her kind words and unwavering patience had planted a powerful seed of belief in him, a belief he carried throughout his journey. Now, Shaq understood that even the smallest act of kindness could profoundly change someone's life. One of the most challenging parts of this journey was grappling with the betrayal of Mrs. Henderson's two sons. He couldn't forget the encounter he had with them, where he saw the shame and helplessness in the eyes of two men who had once been the recipients of her boundless love. Shaq once thought he could never forgive them. He was angry at their neglect, at how they turned their backs on their mother when she needed them most. But as he delved deeper into their circumstances, he realized that selfishness isn't always a trait. It's often born out of fear and ignorance. They hadn't just turned their backs on Mrs. Henderson, they had turned their backs on their own values. Shaq spoke to them, not to accuse but to help them see that there was still time to make things right. "You can't change the past," he told them, "but you can change from this moment on. She doesn't need your money or empty promises. She needs the love and care that only you can give." Those words were like a wake-up call. One of her sons began visiting her at the education center, bringing small gifts and sharing stories about their family. Though the pain lingered, Shaq saw that this slow but steady change was the first step toward healing a broken relationship. For Shaq, this journey became a testament to the power of compassion. He realized that in a world filled with injustice and suffering, kindness isn't just a personal act. It's the only way to create real change. What he did for Mrs. Henderson wasn't monumental compared to what she had done for him, but it gave him faith that everyone could make a difference. "You once taught me how to believe in myself," Shaq told her one afternoon as they sat by the window of her small apartment. "But now, you've taught me how to believe in the power of helping others. I never thought that helping someone could make me feel so fulfilled." After helping Mrs. Henderson, Shaq began to reflect on his life and realized there were countless others like her, people who had dedicated their lives to building others up but were left abandoned and forgotten. He decided to establish a charitable foundation focused on supporting elderly teachers who had contributed to society yet lacked the care they deserved. He also became involved in community programs, speaking to young people about the power of gratitude and the responsibility to care for those who came before them. "If we don't care for the people who once lifted us up," he said during a seminar, "then we are rejecting the very values that shaped who we are today." This journey taught Shaq that success isn't measured by fame or wealth, but by how one treats others. Compassion is the highest virtue a person can possess. Looking back, Shaq knew that while he had achieved many things in his career, helping Mrs. Henderson was one of the most meaningful accomplishments of his life. She wasn't just the teacher who changed his life. She was the person who taught him how to live a life of purpose. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," he thought as he watched her stand at the podium. "You've taught me more than I ever imagined, and I will never forget this lesson." In Shaq's heart, he knew this wasn't an ending, but the beginning of a new journey. A journey where he would continue to spread kindness and change the lives of those in need. The warm light from the classroom window reflected off Mrs. Henderson's silver hair, highlighting her gentle smile as she guided the children. The chalk in her hand glided effortlessly across the blackboard, each letter a testament to her return, not just to teaching, but to herself and her true worth. The children sat attentively, their eyes gleaming with hope. Shaq stood at a distance, quietly observing. His eyes shone with pride, but more than that, with deep gratitude. Mrs. Henderson wasn't just someone who had changed his life. She was living proof of the power of resilience and compassion. Not long ago, Shaq had seen a very different Mrs. Henderson, a woman crushed by betrayal from her loved ones and the indifference of society. But now, she was no longer a forgotten shadow on the cold sidewalks of Skid Row. She stood tall, exuding confidence and pride as if she had never lost herself. In Shaq's heart, he couldn't help but recall those early days of reconnecting with her, the memories of the hardship she endured, the pain of being abandoned by her two sons. Although they had started trying to make amends, Shaq knew the scars she carried could never completely fade. Yet her quiet forgiveness spoke volumes. Forgiveness wasn't about whether others deserved it, but about freeing oneself. As Shaq watched Mrs. Henderson on the podium, he realized this journey wasn't just about her or him. It was a reminder for everyone. Acts of kindness, no matter how small, have the power to ripple outward and change the world. Shaq couldn't ignore the injustice Mrs. Henderson had suffered, and he knew he could use his influence to help even more people. The charitable foundation he had established was already making an impact, not just supporting elderly teachers, but also providing educational opportunities for underprivileged children, the very ones like those Mrs. Henderson was now teaching. "Every single one of us can do something," Shaq once said in an interview. "You don't have to be wealthy or famous to make a difference. Sometimes, just a simple act of kindness, a word, a touch, can completely change someone's life." Mrs. Henderson's story wasn't just one of pain and rebirth. It was a reminder that none of us are ever truly forgotten as long as someone is willing to extend a helping hand. Shaq realized that what mattered wasn't the scale of the help, but the sincerity and humanity behind it. From being a person abandoned by society, Mrs. Henderson had rediscovered her worth through the compassion of a former student. Yet Shaq knew she had taught him the greatest lesson of all, the lesson of kindness and the power to change the world through even the smallest gestures. When the class ended, Mrs. Henderson bowed to the children, a radiant smile lighting up her face. A few kids ran up to her, chattering excitedly and sharing their innocent stories. She listened intently, her eyes sparkling with joy. This was her purpose, rediscovered and alive again. Shaq walked into the classroom and their eyes met in a moment of profound emotion. No words were needed. They both understood that they had rewritten a story, not just their own, but one that would inspire countless others. "Thank you, Shaquille," she said, her voice warm and filled with gratitude. "No, Mrs. Henderson," Shaq replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm the one who should thank you for everything you've done, not just for me, but for this world." The story closed with the image of Shaq and Mrs. Henderson standing side by side, watching the children laugh and chatter. It wasn't just Mrs. Henderson's rebirth. It was a poignant reminder of the power of kindness and gratitude. Each of us has the ability to make a difference. Big or small, acts of kindness can ripple outward and transform the world. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to stand up and lend a hand to rewrite an entire life. And the story of Shaq and Mrs. Henderson is living proof of that. The story of Shaquille O'Neal and Mrs. Henderson is a powerful testament to the strength of gratitude and kindness. From a teacher once forgotten by society, Mrs. Henderson found her worth and faith in life again through an act of compassion. At the same time, Shaq's journey to help her taught him invaluable lessons about the meaning of giving and empathy. Have you ever thought that a small act of yours could completely change someone's life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, please like and share it to spread this meaningful message to more people. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this. Let's spread hope and kindness together, because the world always needs acts of kindness, no matter how small.